Sarah clutched her newborn daughter close to her chest as the wagon wheels bumped along the rough frontier trail. Every jolt sent sharp pain through her body, reminding her that it had only been 3 days since little Emma had come into the world. The canvas cover above provided little protection from the dust that swirled around them, and Sarah found herself coughing repeatedly, trying to shield the baby from the gritty air. Her husband Thomas sat beside her, his weathered hands gripping the reins tightly. His face showed the strain of the past weeks. They had been traveling for 2 months now, heading west to claim their homestead in Colorado Territory. The promise of free land had seemed like a dream come true back in Missouri, but now Sarah wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. The birth had happened unexpectedly while they were camped near a small creek. Thomas had done his best to help, but he was a farmer, not a doctor. Sarah had lost a lot of blood and she still felt weak and dizzy. The other families in their wagon train had been kind, offering what help they could. But everyone was eager to reach their destination before winter set in. As the day wore on, Sarah noticed Thomas kept looking over his shoulder. She had seen him do this several times in the past few days, and it made her nervous. When she asked him about it, he would just say he was being careful, but she could see the worry in his eyes. Around midday, they stopped to rest the oxen and eat a simple meal of hardtack and dried meat. Sarah tried to nurse little Emma, but the baby seemed fussy and wouldn't settle. Mrs. Henderson, an older woman traveling with her son's family, came over to help. "You need proper rest?" "Dear," Mrs. Henderson said, feeling Sarah's forehead, "you're still running a fever. This traveling so soon after giving birth isn't good for you or the baby." Sarah knew she was right, but what choice did they have? They couldn't afford to fall behind the wagon train. Winter was coming, and being caught alone on the frontier with a newborn would be even more dangerous. That afternoon, as they continued their journey, dark clouds began gathering on the horizon. Thomas urged the oxen forward, hoping to find shelter before the storm hit. But the clouds moved faster than their slow-moving wagon, and soon rain began pelting down on them. The rain quickly turned the trail into a muddy mess. The wagon wheels sank deep into the soft ground, and the oxen struggled to pull their load. Other wagons in the train were having the same problem, and soon the entire group had to stop. Thomas and the other men worked together, trying to free the stuck wagons and lay boards across the worst parts of the trail. Sarah sat in the wagon, holding Emma and listening to the rain pound against the canvas. Water began leaking through in several places, and she did her best to keep the baby dry. As evening approached, it became clear they wouldn't be able to continue that day. The wagon master, a gruff man named Captain Morrison, made the decision to make camp where they were. The families circled their wagons and tried to make the best of a bad situation. Sarah's condition worsened as the night went on. The fever that had been bothering her all day grew stronger, and she began shivering uncontrollably. Thomas wrapped her in every blanket they had, but she couldn't seem to get warm. Emma cried constantly, sensing her mother's distress. Dr. Williams, a retired physician traveling with another family, came to examine Sarah. His expression was grave as he felt her pulse and looked at her pale complexion. "She's lost too much blood," he told Thomas quietly, "and now she's got an infection. She needs proper medical care and rest, not this rough traveling." Thomas felt his heart sink. They were still weeks away from any real town, and there was no way to get Sarah the help she needed. All he could do was try to keep her comfortable and pray that she would get better. During the night, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness. In her fevered dreams, she saw strange images, tall figures on horseback watching them from distant hills, and the feeling that they were being followed. When she tried to tell Thomas about her dreams, he assured her it was just the fever making her imagine things. But Thomas had his own worries. He had indeed noticed riders in the distance, always staying just far enough away that he couldn't make out who they were. The other men in the wagon train had seen them too, and everyone was on edge. They all knew the stories about what could happen to settlers on the frontier. Captain Morrison doubled the guard that night, but the storm made it hard to see anything beyond the circle of wagons. The rain continued to fall, turning their campsite into a muddy swamp. When morning came, Sarah was worse. She could barely lift her head, and little Emma's cries had grown weaker. Thomas knew they couldn't continue the journey, but Captain Morrison was firm. The wagon train had to keep moving. "I'm sorry, Thomas," the captain said, "but I've got 40 other families to think about. We can't wait any longer or we'll all be trapped by winter. Thomas faced an impossible choice: stay behind with his sick wife and newborn daughter, alone on the dangerous frontier, or force Sarah to endure more traveling when she might not survive it. As the other families began preparing to leave, Thomas made his decision. He would stay with Sarah and try to nurse her back to health. They would have to catch up with the wagon train later, or find another way to reach their destination. Mrs. Henderson pressed a small bag of herbs into his hands. "Make tea from these," she whispered. "It might help with the fever." One by one, the wagons pulled away, leaving Thomas, Sarah, and baby Emma alone beside the muddy trail. Thomas watched until the last wagon disappeared over a hill, then turned back to his wife. She was sleeping fitfully and her breathing was shallow. As he sat beside her holding their daughter, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Somewhere out there in the vast wilderness, unknown eyes were upon them. He checked his rifle and made sure it was loaded, then settled in to wait and see what the day would bring. The sun climbed higher in the sky, burning off some of the clouds from the night before. In the distance, Thomas could hear the sound of hoofbeats growing steadily closer. Thomas heard the hoofbeats getting closer and quickly moved to the front of the wagon, rifle in hand. His heart pounded as he tried to count how many riders were approaching. Through the morning mist, he could see at least 6 horses moving toward their camp. Sarah stirred in the wagon behind him, mumbling something he couldn't understand. Little Emma had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from crying through the night. Thomas wished desperately that the wagon train was still with them, but now he was alone to face whatever was coming. The riders emerged from the mist, and Thomas felt his blood run cold. They were Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, carrying bows and rifles. The lead rider was a tall man with long black hair and fierce dark eyes. He sat on his horse with the confidence of someone who had never known fear. Thomas raised his rifle, though his hands shook slightly. He knew he might get one shot before they overwhelmed him, but he had to protect his family. The Apache warriors spread out in a half-circle around the wagon, cutting off any escape route. The leader held up his hand and the other warriors stopped. He studied Thomas for a long moment, then looked at the wagon where Sarah and the baby lay hidden. His expression was unreadable, but Thomas could see intelligence in his eyes. "You are alone," the Apache said in clear English, surprising Thomas. His voice was deep and calm, not threatening as Thomas had expected. "My wife is sick," Thomas replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "She just had a baby. We couldn't keep up with the others." The Apache leader dismounted and took a step closer. Thomas tightened his grip on the rifle, but something in the warrior's manner made him hesitate. There was no aggression in his movements, only curiosity. "My name is Nalnish," the Apache said. "These are my brothers. We have been watching your people cross our land for many days." Thomas didn't lower his weapon, but he didn't fire either. "What do you want from us?" Nalnish tilted his head, listening to something. It took Thomas a moment to realize he was hearing Sarah's labored breathing and Emma's weak cries from inside the wagon. "The woman is dying," Nalnish said matter-of-factly. "And the child too, perhaps." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had been trying not to think about how bad Sarah looked, how weak her voice had become. But hearing it spoken aloud by this stranger made it real in a way that terrified him. "She needs medicine," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "A doctor, but there's nothing I can do for her here." Nalnish spoke quickly to his men in Apache, then turned back to Thomas. "Put down your weapon." "You cannot help her, but perhaps we can," Thomas hesitated. Everything he had been told about the Apache said they were dangerous, that they killed settlers without mercy. But looking at Nalnish, he saw something unexpected: concern. Not for him, perhaps, but for the suffering woman and child in the wagon. Slowly, Thomas lowered his rifle. If the Apache wanted to kill them, his one gun wouldn't stop them anyway. And if there was even a small chance they could help Sarah, he had to take it. Nalnish nodded and approached the wagon. Thomas followed nervously as the Apache warrior looked inside. Sarah was pale as death, her lips cracked and dry. Little Emma lay beside her, making tiny whimpering sounds that barely qualified as cries. "Childbed fever," Nalnish said, touching Sarah's forehead briefly. "Very bad. Without help, she will be dead before the sun sets." Thomas felt tears sting his eyes. "Can you help her?" "Please, I'll do anything." Nalnish studied him for a long moment. "My grandmother is a medicine woman. She knows the old ways of healing. But our village is half a day's ride from here. Then take us there, Thomas said immediately. I don't care about anything else. Just help my wife and daughter. You would trust Apache with your family? Nalnish asked, and Thomas thought he heard surprise in his voice. Thomas looked at Sarah's still form, at his tiny daughter, who might not live another day. You're the only hope they have. Nalnish spoke to his men again, and they began moving with purpose. 2 of them rode away quickly, presumably to prepare the village for their arrival. The others began examining the wagon and oxen. Your animals are tired, Nalnish said. They cannot move fast enough. You and your family will ride with us. My men will bring your wagon later. Thomas wanted to argue, to insist on staying with their belongings, but he knew the Apache was right. Speed was more important than possessions right now. Working together, they carefully lifted Sarah from the wagon. She barely stirred, which frightened Thomas more than anything else. Nalnish mounted his horse and took Sarah in his arms, holding her securely against his chest. Another warrior took baby Emma, wrapping her carefully in soft deerskin. Thomas climbed onto a horse behind one of the other Apache. He had never ridden bareback before, and he struggled to stay balanced as they set off at a fast pace across the rough terrain. They rode hard for hours, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and check on Sarah and Emma. Nalnish seemed to handle Sarah's limp form with surprising gentleness, adjusting his hold whenever the terrain got rough. The warrior carrying Emma spoke softly to the baby in Apache, and somehow his voice seemed to calm her crying. As they traveled, Thomas found himself studying these men who had taken his family. They were nothing like the savage killers he had been told to expect. They moved across the landscape with an easy confidence, reading signs in the land that Thomas couldn't even see. They spoke quietly among themselves, often laughing at shared jokes. The landscape changed as they rode deeper into Apache territory. The flat plains gave way to red rock formations and hidden canyons. Thomas realized that even if he wanted to escape, he would be hopelessly lost within minutes. He was completely dependent on these strangers now. Near sunset, they crested a ridge and Thomas saw their destination below. The Apache village was smaller than he had expected, maybe 30 dome-shaped shelters scattered along a creek in a hidden valley. Smoke rose from cooking fires and children played near the water's edge. As they rode into the village, people came out to stare at the white strangers. Thomas saw curiosity in their faces, but no hostility. Women pointed at little Emma and spoke in concerned voices. An elderly woman with silver hair braided with beads approached Nalnish's horse. "This is my grandmother, Ayana," Nalnish said to Thomas. "She will help your wife." The old woman looked up at Sarah's pale face and began speaking rapidly in Apache. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the urgency in her voice. They carried Sarah into one of the larger shelters, where Ayana immediately began examining her. She spoke sharply to several younger women, who hurried away and returned with bundles of herbs and clay pots filled with different medicines. Thomas wanted to stay close to Sarah, but Nalnish gently guided him outside. "Let the women work," he said. "They know what to do." As night fell over the Apache village, Thomas sat by a fire with Nalnish, listening to the sounds of healing rituals coming from the shelter where his wife fought for her life. He had trusted these strangers with everything he held dear, and now all he could do was wait and pray that he had made the right choice. 3 weeks had passed since their arrival at the Apache village, and Thomas could hardly believe the transformation in his family. Sarah was sitting up now, able to hold Emma and even take short walks around the camp. The color had returned to her cheeks and her strength grew a little more each day. Emma had become the darling of the village. Apache women would stop their work just to hold her and coo over her bright blue eyes. They made her tiny moccasins and decorated blankets, treating her as if she were their own grandchild. Thomas watched with amazement as his daughter babbled back at them in what sounded almost like Apache words. But Thomas was beginning to worry about other things. The leaves on the cottonwood trees along the creek were turning yellow, and the nights were getting colder. Soon the mountain passes would be blocked with snow, making travel impossible until spring. If they were going to continue their journey west, they needed to leave soon. The problem was that Sarah, despite her improvement, was still far from being strong enough for the rigors of frontier travel. Dr. Williams back with the wagon train had been right. She needed months of rest and good food to fully recover from the difficult birth and infection. Thomas discussed his concerns with Nalnish as they worked together, repairing the village's winter shelters. The Apache warrior listened thoughtfully as Thomas explained their dilemma. "You are worried about the winter," Nalnish observed, "and about the land you meant to claim." "If we don't reach Colorado before the first snow, we'll lose our chance," Thomas said. "The good homestead plots will all be taken by other settlers. We'll have to wait until spring, and by then—" He shrugged helplessly. "By then you will have learned to see this land differently," Nalnish said. "Perhaps you will not want to leave." Thomas paused in his work. Over the past weeks, he had indeed begun to see things differently. The Apache way of life was harder in some ways than what he had known back in Missouri, but it was also more connected to the natural world. They lived lightly on the land, taking only what they needed and giving back what they could. "What if Sarah wants to go?" Thomas asked. "What if she can't accept living this way permanently?" Before Nalnish could answer, they heard shouting from the edge of the village. Thomas looked up to see riders approaching, but these weren't Apache. They were white men, and they carried themselves with the bearing of soldiers or lawmen. Nalnish stood immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward his knife. "Stay here," he told Thomas. "Let me handle this." But Thomas was already moving toward the riders. If these men were looking for him and his family, he couldn't hide behind his Apache protectors. As he got closer, he could see there were 5 of them, all armed and dusty from hard travel. The leader was a tall man with a gray beard and a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. His eyes swept over the village, taking in the Apache women and children who had gathered to watch the strangers. "I'm Sheriff Morrison," the man called out. "I'm looking for a white family, man, woman, and baby. They were supposed to be traveling with a wagon train heading west." Thomas stepped forward, his heart pounding. "I'm Thomas Mitchell. That's my family you're looking for." Sheriff Morrison's eyes lit up. "Thank God. We've been tracking you for weeks." He dismounted and approached Thomas, but his men stayed on their horses, hands near their weapons. "Who sent you?" Thomas asked. "Your brother-in-law, James. When the wagon train reached Denver without you, Captain Morrison sent word back. James got worried and hired us to find you." Morrison looked around the village with obvious suspicion. "Are you all right? Are you being held captive?" Thomas almost laughed at the question. "Captive? No, Sheriff. These people saved my wife's life. She nearly died from childbed fever, and they've been caring for our family." Morrison frowned. "You're living with Apache? By choice?" "By necessity," Thomas replied firmly. "And by gratitude. They've shown us nothing but kindness." One of Morrison's men, a younger deputy with nervous eyes, spoke up. "Sheriff, we should get them out of here quickly. You never know when these savages might turn hostile." Nalnish had approached during this conversation, moving silently as was his way. Thomas saw the deputy's hand move to his gun and quickly stepped between them. "This is Nalnish," Thomas said loudly. "He's the man who saved my family's life. I won't have anyone threatening him." Sheriff Morrison studied Nalnish carefully. The Apache warrior stood calmly, showing no fear despite being outnumbered by armed men. There was something in his bearing that commanded respect, even from those who might consider him an enemy. "No one's threatening anyone," Morrison said finally. "But we need to get you folks back to civilization. Your brother-in-law is worried sick and winter's coming fast." Thomas felt torn in 2 directions. Part of him wanted to return to the familiar world he had known, to claim the land they had planned for and build the life they had dreamed of. But another part of him had found something precious here in this hidden valley, a sense of community and connection to the land that he had never experienced before. "I need to talk to my wife," Thomas said. "This decision affects all of us." Morrison nodded. "Of course. But don't take too long. We need to leave within the hour if we're going to make it back to the main trail before dark." Thomas hurried to the healing lodge where Sarah was resting with Emma. When he explained what was happening, he saw the same conflict in her eyes that he felt in his heart. "James sent them?" she asked softly. "He must be so worried about us." "Sarah, you're not strong enough for hard travel yet," Thomas said. "The doctor said you need more time to recover." Sarah looked around the lodge where she had been cared for with such gentleness. Ayanna sat in the corner working on a beaded necklace for Emma. The old woman had barely left Sarah's side for 3 weeks, monitoring her recovery with the devotion of a grandmother. "What do you want to do?" Sarah asked. Thomas took her hand. "I want to do what's best for you and Emma. But honestly, I'm not sure what that is anymore." Through the lodge opening, they could see Sheriff Morrison and his men waiting impatiently. The Apache villagers had gathered at a respectful distance, watching the drama unfold. Thomas could see children peeking out from behind their mothers' skirts, and he realized with a pang that he had grown fond of these people. "If we go now, we'll probably never see them again," Sarah said quietly. "And if we stay, we'll be choosing a completely different life than what we planned." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching Emma sleep peacefully in her Apache-made cradle. Finally, she looked up at Thomas with clear eyes. "These people saved my life and Emma's life," she said. "But more than that, they welcomed us as family. Back in Missouri, our own neighbors barely spoke to us when times got hard. Here, strangers became family." Thomas felt his heart racing. "Are you saying you want to stay?" "I'm saying I want to choose what's right, not what's expected." Sarah struggled to sit up straighter. "But I also know you have dreams about that homestead, about the life we planned." Outside, they could hear Sheriff Morrison calling for Thomas. Time was running out, and they had to make a decision that would change everything. Thomas stepped outside the healing lodge to face Sheriff Morrison, his mind still reeling from the impossible decision he and Sarah had to make. The sheriff was pacing impatiently, checking the sun's position in the sky. "Mitchell, we need to move," Morrison said urgently. "It's a 2-day ride back to the main trail, and I don't want to be caught out here after dark." "Sheriff, my wife is still recovering from a serious illness," Thomas began. "I'm not sure she can handle hard travel yet." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "I understand your concern, but we've got a sturdy wagon waiting just outside the valley. We can make her comfortable for the journey. And once we get back to Denver, she'll have access to proper medical care." Thomas looked around the village, seeing it with new eyes. What had seemed strange and frightening just weeks ago now felt like home. The Apache children who had been shy at first now ran up to greet him whenever they saw him. The men included him in their work and conversations. The women fussed over Emma as if she were their own blood. "There's something you need to understand, Sheriff," Thomas said slowly. "These people aren't holding us prisoner. We're here because we choose to be." Morrison frowned. "You can't seriously be considering staying with a bunch of savages. Think about your daughter. What kind of life would she have here?" The word savages hit Thomas like a slap. He thought about Ayanna's gentle hands caring for Sarah through her darkest hours. He remembered Nalnish risking his own safety to help strangers. He saw the Apache children playing happily by the creek, watched over by parents who loved them fiercely. "These people saved my family's life," Thomas said firmly. "They've shown us more kindness than we ever received from our own neighbors back in Missouri. I won't have you calling them savages." Morrison's men shifted uneasily in their saddles. The deputy who had spoken earlier was eyeing the Apache warriors who had gathered nearby, his hand still hovering near his gun. Nalnish appeared at Thomas's side, moving with his characteristic silence. "Is there a problem, my friend?" he asked in English, though his eyes were fixed on the armed deputies. "No problem," Thomas said quickly. "Sheriff Morrison here was just explaining that they've come to take us back to Denver." Nalnish nodded slowly. "And you have decided to go?" Before Thomas could answer, Sarah emerged from the healing lodge carrying Emma. She moved carefully, still weak from her ordeal, but her eyes were clear and determined. Ayanna followed close behind, ready to catch Sarah if she stumbled. Sheriff Morrison removed his hat when he saw Sarah. "Ma'am, I'm Sheriff Morrison. Your brother-in-law James sent us to find you. Are you all right?" Sarah looked at the sheriff, then at his nervous deputies, then at the Apache people who had surrounded them protectively. "I'm alive, Sheriff. Thanks to these people, I'm alive." "We need to get you back to civilization, ma'am," Morrison pressed. "This is no place for a white woman and child." Sarah's chin lifted slightly. "And why is that, Sheriff? Because these people are different from us? Because they speak a different language or worship different spirits?" Morrison seemed taken aback by her response. "Ma'am, these are Apache. They're hostiles. They raid settlements and kill innocent people." "Funny," Sarah said quietly. "I was told the same thing about white settlers by an Apache woman whose family was killed by soldiers. It seems everyone is capable of both kindness and cruelty, regardless of the color of their skin." Thomas felt a surge of pride at his wife's words. The Sarah who had left Missouri had been timid and uncertain, always deferring to others' opinions. The woman standing before him now had found her voice and her strength. "Ma'am, I respect what these people have done for you," Morrison said, clearly struggling to remain diplomatic. But you can't stay here permanently. What about your daughter's education? What about medical care when you need it? What about your future? Emma chose that moment to wake up and begin fussing. Immediately, several Apache women stepped forward, making soft cooing sounds. One of them, a young mother named Itzel, gently took Emma from Sarah's arms and began rocking her. The baby quieted instantly, seeming to recognize the woman who had helped care for her. "She seems well cared for here," Sarah observed. Sheriff Morrison's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Look, I understand you feel grateful to these people, but you're thinking with your emotions, not your head. Winter's coming and you need to be somewhere safe and civilized." "Safe?" Nalnish spoke up quietly. "Your wagon trains bring disease that kills our children. Your soldiers shoot our hunters when they try to feed their families. Your miners poison our streams. Tell me, Sheriff, who is truly safe?" The deputy's hand moved closer to his gun. "You watch your tone, Indian." The tension in the air became electric. Thomas saw Apache warriors moving closer, their own weapons within easy reach. What had started as a rescue mission was about to become a bloodbath. "Stop," Thomas said loudly, stepping between the two groups. "Nobody needs to die here today." He turned to Sheriff Morrison. "I appreciate that James sent you, and I understand you're just doing your job. But you can't force us to leave. We're free citizens and we choose to stay." Morrison's face reddened. "You're making a mistake, Mitchell. A big one. When winter comes, when you need supplies or medical help, don't expect the cavalry to come riding to your rescue." "We won't," Sarah said simply. "We'll rely on the people who have already proven they care about our welfare." Sheriff Morrison looked around the village one more time, his expression a mixture of disgust and disbelief. "Fine, it's your funeral, but I'm not leaving without documenting this decision officially." He pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil from his saddlebag. "I need you both to sign a statement saying you're staying of your own free will, that you haven't been coerced or threatened. That way, when things go bad, nobody can blame me for not trying to save you." Thomas and Sarah looked at each other. This was it, the moment of final decision. Once they signed that paper, there would be no going back. They would be choosing to abandon everything they had planned for a future they couldn't even imagine. Sarah reached for the pencil first. In clear, firm handwriting, she wrote her name at the bottom of the sheriff's statement. Then she handed the pencil to Thomas. For a moment, Thomas hesitated. He thought about the homestead they would never claim, the conventional life they would never live. Then he looked at his wife, strong and confident despite everything she had been through. He looked at his daughter, content in the arms of an Apache woman who loved her. He looked at Nalnish, who had become more than a friend. He had become a brother. Thomas signed his name beneath Sarah's. Sheriff Morrison snatched the paper back and stuffed it into his pocket. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he muttered. He mounted his horse and gestured to his men. "Let's get out of here before these people change their minds about being friendly." As the sheriff and his deputies rode away, the Apache villagers began to relax. Children ran back to their games, and the warriors put away their weapons. But Thomas noticed that several of the men continued to watch the horizon, until the dust from the sheriff's horses had completely disappeared. Nalnish placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You have chosen a difficult path, my friend. Are you certain this is what you want?" Thomas looked at Sarah, who was smiling as she watched Emma babbling happily with the Apache women. "I'm certain we've chosen the right path," he said. "I just hope we're strong enough to walk it." "Strength comes from knowing who your family is," Nalnish replied. "And today you have proven that you truly understand what family means." That evening, the village held a celebration feast. Ayanna presented Sarah with a beautiful necklace made of turquoise and silver, a symbol of her acceptance into the tribe. Thomas received a new name, Brave Heart, because of his willingness to trust strangers with his family's life. As they sat around the fire, sharing food and stories with their Apache family, Thomas realized that they had found something more valuable than any homestead. They had found a place where they truly belonged. The sheriff had been wrong about one thing. They weren't thinking with their emotions instead of their heads. They were thinking with their hearts, and sometimes that was the smartest thing of all. Winter came early that year, with the first snow falling just 2 weeks after Sheriff Morrison's visit. Thomas woke one morning to find the village transformed into a white wonderland, the dome-shaped shelters looking like gentle hills under their blanket of snow. The Apache had spent weeks preparing for winter, and Thomas had learned to help with the preparations. They had dried meat and vegetables, gathered firewood, and winterized the shelters with extra layers of hides and thick blankets. Thomas had never realized how much work went into surviving a frontier winter without the conveniences of civilization. Sarah's health had continued to improve throughout the autumn months. She was now strong enough to help the women with their daily tasks, learning to prepare traditional Apache foods and medicines. Emma had grown into a chubby, happy baby who crawled fearlessly around the village, babbling in a mixture of English and Apache words that delighted everyone. But winter brought new challenges Thomas hadn't anticipated. Food became scarce as the stored supplies dwindled and hunting became more difficult in the deep snow. The Apache hunters had to travel farther and farther to find game, and sometimes they returned empty-handed. Thomas tried to help with the hunting, but he quickly realized he was more hindrance than help. His movements were too noisy, his tracking skills non-existent. The Apache hunters were polite about his attempts, but he could see they were humoring him rather than truly including him. The situation became more serious when several of the village children fell ill with a fever that wouldn't break. Ayana worked tirelessly to treat them with her traditional medicines, but one little girl, the daughter of Thomas's friend Kuruk, grew steadily worse. Thomas watched helplessly as the child's parents maintained their vigil beside her bed. He remembered his own terror when Sarah had been dying, and he wished desperately that he could do something to help. But what did he know about Apache medicine or treating sick children? It was Nalnish who suggested a solution that surprised everyone. "Your people have medicines we do not," he said to Thomas one evening as they sat by the fire. "Perhaps there is something in your wagon that could help little Ayana." Thomas had almost forgotten about their wagon and belongings, which the Apache had carefully stored in a cave at the edge of the valley. They had seemed so unimportant compared to the immediate needs of survival. But now he realized they might contain something valuable. The next morning, despite the bitter cold, Thomas and several Apache men made the difficult journey to retrieve his possessions. Inside the wagon, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, Thomas found Sarah's small collection of medicines from back east. There was laudanum for pain, quinine for fever, and most importantly, a bottle of carbolic acid that a doctor had given them for disinfecting wounds. When they returned to the village, Thomas showed the medicines to Ayana. The old medicine woman examined each bottle carefully, smelling the contents and asking detailed questions about their uses. Her eyes lit up when Thomas explained about the carbolic acid. Working together, Ayana and Thomas developed a treatment plan that combined Apache traditional medicine with the Western drugs. They used the quinine to reduce the little girl's fever, while continuing Ayana's herbal treatments to boost her strength. For 3 days, they took turns caring for the child around the clock. Thomas found himself learning more about Apache healing methods than he had ever imagined possible. Ayana showed him which herbs fought infection, which ones reduced pain, and how to prepare them properly. On the 4th day, little Ayana's fever finally broke. She opened her eyes and asked for water in a weak but clear voice. Her parents wept with relief, and the entire village celebrated the recovery of their youngest member. "You saved her," Kuruk told Thomas, gripping his hand tightly. "Without your medicine, she would have died." But Thomas knew it had been the combination of both medical traditions that had made the difference. Neither approach alone would have been enough. It had taken the wisdom of both cultures working together. Word of the successful treatment spread quickly through the village, and Thomas found his status changing once again. He was no longer just a guest being cared for out of kindness. He had become a valued member of the community, someone who contributed unique skills and knowledge. As winter deepened, Thomas threw himself into learning everything he could about Apache life. He studied their language with the dedication of a scholar, practiced their hunting techniques despite his continued clumsiness, and absorbed their stories and customs. But the greatest change was in his relationship with the land itself. The Apache didn't see the desert as a harsh place to be conquered, but as a living entity to be respected and understood. They read the landscape like Thomas had once read books, finding water sources hidden beneath the surface and predicting weather patterns from subtle signs in the sky. One particularly cold evening, as Thomas sat with Nalnish working on new arrows for spring hunting, his friend asked him a question that had been weighing on his mind. When the snow melts and travel becomes possible again, will you want to continue your journey west? Thomas paused in his work. The question had been haunting him for weeks. Part of him still dreamed of that homestead in Colorado, of building a conventional life for his family. But a larger part of him had found something here that he had never expected, a sense of purpose and belonging that went deeper than land ownership. I don't know, Thomas admitted. When we first arrived, I thought we would stay just long enough for Sarah to recover. But now you see that home is not a place you claim, but a place that claims you, Nalnish finished. Before Thomas could respond, they heard commotion from outside. Voices were calling out in alarm, and people were emerging from their shelters despite the bitter cold. Thomas and Nalnish hurried outside to see what was happening. In the distance, silhouetted against the snow-covered hills, they could see riders approaching the village. Even from far away, Thomas could tell these weren't Apache. The way they sat their horses, the way they moved across the landscape was all wrong. Soldiers, Nalnish said grimly. A full patrol, maybe 20 men. Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. Why would cavalry soldiers be riding through Apache territory in the dead of winter? And what would happen when they found a white family living peacefully among the people they considered enemies? As the riders drew closer, Thomas could see the blue uniforms and military bearing that confirmed Nalnish's identification. At their head rode an officer with a trim beard and hard eyes that swept over the village like a hawk searching for prey. Get Sarah and Emma, Nalnish said quietly. Take them inside and keep them hidden until we know what these soldiers want. But Thomas shook his head. No. If they're here because of us, hiding will only make things worse. We face this together. The soldiers had reached the edge of the village now, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold air. The officer raised his hand, signaling his men to halt, then rode forward alone. I'm Captain Harrison, United States Cavalry, he announced in a voice that carried across the silent village. I'm looking for a white family reported to be living with hostiles. Thomas and Sarah Mitchell and their infant daughter. Thomas stepped forward, his heart pounding but his voice steady. I'm Thomas Mitchell. What do you want with us? Captain Harrison's eyes fixed on him with interest. Mr. Mitchell, I have orders to escort you and your family to the nearest military post for your own protection. This area is considered hostile territory and civilians are not safe here. Safe? Thomas almost laughed. Captain, my family has been safer here than anywhere else we've ever lived. The captain's expression hardened. Nevertheless, you will come with us. That's not a request, Mr. Mitchell. That's an order. Thomas felt the weight of every eye in the village upon him as he faced Captain Harrison. Behind the cavalry officer, 20 soldiers sat ready on their horses, hands near their weapons. The Apache villagers had emerged from their shelters despite the bitter cold, forming a protective circle around Thomas and his family. Captain, with respect, you have no authority to order civilians around, Thomas said, trying to keep his voice calm. We're here by choice and we're not leaving. Harrison's jaw tightened. Mr. Mitchell, I have reports that you and your family are being held captive by hostile Apache. My orders are to secure your release and escort you to safety. Reports from whom? Thomas demanded. Sheriff Morrison? We signed a statement saying we were here voluntarily. A statement signed under duress doesn't count for much, Harrison replied. And frankly, Mr. Mitchell, I find it hard to believe any civilized person would choose to live among savages unless they were being coerced. Sarah appeared at Thomas's side, carrying Emma bundled against the cold. Despite having given birth in difficult circumstances just months ago, she stood tall and proud, meeting the captain's gaze without flinching. Captain Harrison, she said clearly, I want you to look at my daughter. Does she look mistreated to you? Does she look like the child of captives? Emma was indeed a picture of health, her cheeks rosy from the cold air, her bright eyes curious about the strangers on horseback. She wore beautiful beaded moccasins made by Apache hands and a warm coat lined with rabbit fur that had been a gift from Ayana. Ma'am, appearances can be deceiving, Harrison said, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. These people are skilled at manipulation. They might treat you well to prevent you from trying to escape. Nalnish stepped forward, his movement fluid and confident despite being outnumbered 4-1 by armed soldiers. Captain, I am Nalnish of the Chiricahua Apache. This man and his family came to us when his wife was dying. We saved her life and they chose to remain with us. There is no captivity here except in your own mind. Harrison's hand moved to his saber hilt. I wasn't addressing you, Indian. The insult sparked immediate tension. Apache warriors emerged from their shelters, and Thomas could see the soldiers' horses shifting nervously as their riders prepared for potential conflict. "These people saved my wife's life," Thomas said loudly, stepping between the two groups. "When she was dying from childbed fever, they took us in and nursed her back to health. They've treated us like family, not prisoners." "Mr. Mitchell, you're obviously suffering from some form of mental distress," Harrison replied. "Living in primitive conditions, away from civilized society, can affect a man's judgment. That's why I'm here, to bring you back to sanity." Thomas felt anger rising in his chest. "My judgment has never been clearer, Captain. I've learned more about what it means to be human in these past months than I did in years of so-called civilized living." Captain Harrison studied the scene before him. Apache family standing protectively around a white couple and their baby. No signs of coercion or fear, only a community united against outside interference. His certainty began to waver visibly. "Captain," Sarah said quietly, "may I ask you something? Do you have children?" Harrison nodded stiffly. "2 sons back in Ohio." "Then you understand a parent's love for their child. Look around this village. Do you see anything but love and care for the children here? Do you see anything but kindness toward my daughter?" As if on cue, little Ayana, the child who had been so sick during the winter, came running through the snow toward Emma. The Apache girl, now healthy and laughing, wanted to play with the baby who had become like a sister to her. Harrison watched the interaction, his expression troubled. His soldiers were growing restless, clearly eager to complete their mission and return to the warmth of their barracks. "Captain," Thomas said, seizing the moment, "I know you're following orders, but those orders are based on false information. We're not captives. We're not being mistreated. We're living exactly as we choose to live." "Sir," one of Harrison's sergeants spoke up, "if they don't want to come, maybe we should just file our report and let headquarters sort it out." Harrison glared at his subordinate. "The Army doesn't leave civilians in hostile territory, Sergeant." "But what if the territory isn't hostile?" Thomas challenged. "What if the only hostility comes from misunderstanding and prejudice?" The captain was quiet for a long moment, studying the peaceful scene around him. Apache children played in the snow while their parents watched protectively. Elderly people sat in doorways despite the cold, offering silent support to their white guests. It didn't look like a war camp or a place where prisoners were held. "Mr. Mitchell," Harrison said finally, "I'll make you a deal. Come with us to the fort just for a few days. Let the post doctor examine your wife and child. Let the chaplain speak with you both. If, after a proper evaluation, you still insist on returning here, I'll escort you back myself." Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances. It wasn't ideal, but it might be the only way to satisfy the military authorities and prevent bloodshed. "And if we refuse?" Thomas asked. Harrison's expression hardened again. "Then I'll have to consider you mentally incompetent and take you by force for your own protection." Nalnish spoke in rapid Apache to the other warriors, and Thomas could see them preparing for a fight. But this wasn't their battle to die for, and Thomas couldn't live with himself if Apache blood was shed because of his family's choices. "We'll come," Thomas said, raising his hand to stop any Apache response. "But only for 3 days, and only if you give your word as an officer that we'll be allowed to return if we choose." "You have my word," Harrison replied, though he clearly thought they were making a mistake they would soon regret. As they prepared to leave, the entire village gathered to say goodbye. Ayana pressed herbs and medicines into Sarah's hands, whispering instructions for their use. The Apache women sang a traveling song to keep Emma safe on the journey. The warriors shook hands with Thomas, calling him by his Apache name, Braveheart. Nalnish was the last to approach. "Remember who you are," he said quietly. "Remember where your true family lives. We will be waiting for your return." As they rode away from the village, Thomas looked back at the people who had become his family. The dome-shaped shelters looked small and vulnerable against the vast winter landscape. But he knew they contained more warmth and love than most of the grand houses he had seen back east. 3 days at the fort turned into a week as Army bureaucrats tried to convince them to abandon their Apache family. The post doctor pronounced Sarah and Emma perfectly healthy. The chaplain spoke with them about Christian duty and civilized living. Officers tried to bribe them with offers of free passage to California and promises of government land grants. But nothing they said could change what Thomas and Sarah had experienced. They had found their true home, and no amount of military pressure could make them abandon it. On the 8th day, Captain Harrison kept his word. He personally escorted them back to the Apache village, though his expression showed he thought they were making the greatest mistake of their lives. As they crested the hill overlooking the hidden valley, Thomas saw smoke rising from the cooking fires and children playing by the creek. Nalnish emerged from one of the shelters and raised his hand in greeting, as if he had never doubted they would return. "Welcome home, Braveheart," he called out as Thomas dismounted, and Thomas knew, with absolute certainty, that he was finally, truly home, not because of the land beneath his feet or the roof over his head, but because of the people who surrounded him with unconditional love and acceptance. Captain Harrison rode away shaking his head, but Thomas didn't care. He had learned that freedom wasn't about claiming territory or following conventional paths. True freedom was choosing where to belong, and he had chosen to belong here with these people, in this life they had built together. As the seasons turned and years passed, Thomas and Sarah's story became legend among both Apache and white settlers. They proved that understanding could bridge any divide, that family was created by love rather than blood, and that sometimes the greatest adventures began not when you reached your destination, but when you discovered that home had been waiting for you in the most unexpected place all along. Thomas spent the longest night of his life sitting by the fire with Nalnish, listening to the sounds coming from the healing lodge. Sometimes he heard chanting, sometimes the murmur of women's voices, and occasionally Emma's weak cries. Every sound made him want to rush inside, but Nalnish's firm hand on his shoulder kept him in place. "Ayana has delivered many babies and saved many mothers," Nalnish said quietly. "She lost her own daughter to the same sickness that takes your wife. She will not let another woman die if she can prevent it." The Apache warrior's words were meant to be comforting, but they only reminded Thomas how close he might be to losing everything. He stared into the flames, watching them dance and flicker like his hopes. "Why are you helping us?" Thomas asked finally. "Your people and mine. We're not exactly friends." Nalnish was quiet for a long time before answering. "Many of your people have crossed our land. Most see us only as obstacles to remove or enemies to fight. But you, when I said your wife was dying, you cried. When I offered help, you trusted me with her life." Thomas looked at the Apache warrior in the firelight. Up close he could see scars on Nalnish's arms and chest, evidence of battles fought and survived. Yet this man had shown more kindness to his family than some of their own neighbors back in Missouri. "I've heard terrible stories," Thomas admitted, "about Apache raids, about settlers being killed. And I have seen terrible things done by white men," Nalnish replied. "Soldiers who shoot first and ask questions later. Settlers who take water sources and drive away the animals we need to survive. But I have also seen white men who show respect for the land and its people." A woman emerged from the healing lodge and spoke quickly to Nalnish in Apache. His expression remained neutral, but Thomas caught the worried tone in her voice. "What did she say?" Thomas asked, his heart racing. "Your wife's fever is very high. Ayana is using strong medicine, but—" Nalnish paused. "She says the next few hours will decide everything." Thomas buried his face in his hands. He had never felt so helpless in his life. Back in Missouri, when problems arose, he could always find a solution through hard work or determination. But here, in this strange place, all he could do was wait. As the night wore on, more women came and went from the healing lodge. Thomas noticed they brought different herbs, heated stones, and bowls of steaming liquid. The Apache took their medicine seriously, he realized. This wasn't just superstition, it was knowledge passed down through generations. Near dawn, Emma's cries suddenly grew stronger. Thomas looked up hopefully, and Nalnish smiled for the first time since they had arrived. "The little one is better," he said. "She has been drinking goat's milk mixed with special herbs. Ayana says she will be strong." Relief washed over Thomas, but it was mixed with continued fear for Sarah. If Emma was improving, why wasn't his wife getting better too? As if reading his thoughts, Nalnish stood up. "Come, Ayana wants to speak with you." Thomas followed him into the healing lodge, his heart pounding. The interior was warm and humid, filled with the strong scents of medicinal herbs. Sarah lay on a bed of soft furs covered with colorful blankets. Her breathing seemed steadier, but her face was still deathly pale. Ayana knelt beside the bed, her weathered hands checking Sarah's pulse. When she saw Thomas, she spoke to Nalnish in Apache, gesturing toward Sarah. "She says your wife is very sick, but she is fighting," Nalnish translated. "The fever is breaking slowly. But she lost too much blood when the baby came. She needs time to heal, and she needs good food to make her blood strong again. Thomas knelt beside his wife and took her hand. It felt cold and fragile, like bird bones. How long before we know if she'll be okay? Ayana spoke again, and Nalnish's expression grew serious. She says your wife cannot travel for many weeks, maybe 2 months before she is strong enough for the journey you were making. The words hit Thomas like a thunderbolt. 2 months meant winter would be starting before they could continue west. They would miss the chance to claim their homestead, and they would have to find somewhere else to spend the cold season. I know what you are thinking, Nalnish said. You worry about your land, about winter coming. But what good is land to a man whose wife is dead? Thomas knew he was right, but the practical problem seemed overwhelming. They had very little money, no way to support themselves, and winter on the frontier was deadly for the unprepared. What am I supposed to do? Thomas asked, his voice breaking. I can't just sit here for 2 months and do nothing. Ayana had been listening to their conversation, and though she didn't speak English, she seemed to understand his distress. She spoke rapidly to Nalnish, pointing at Thomas and then toward the village outside. My grandmother says you can stay with us, Nalnish said. You can work to help the village, and in return we will care for your family until they are strong enough to travel. Thomas stared at him in amazement. You would do that? Let us live here? You trusted us with your family's lives, Nalnish replied. Now we offer to share our home with you. But you must understand, if you stay, you live as we live. You follow our customs and respect our ways. Thomas looked down at Sarah, then at little Emma sleeping peacefully in a cradle made of woven grass. His original plan was in ruins, but his family was alive. That was what mattered most. What kind of work? He asked. Nalnish smiled. You are a farmer, yes? We have gardens that need tending, and our horses always need care. Some of our young men could learn from you about growing crops, and you could learn from us about living in this land. The idea was so different from everything Thomas had planned that it made his head spin. Instead of claiming a homestead in Colorado, he would be living with Apache, learning their ways of life. It wasn't what he had dreamed of, but it might be exactly what his family needed. Over the next few days, Sarah's condition slowly improved. The fever broke completely, and she began taking small amounts of food. Emma grew stronger every day, drinking the special milk mixture Ayana prepared for her. Thomas found himself settling into the rhythm of village life. He worked in the gardens, learning how the Apache grew corn, beans, and squash in the harsh desert environment. They used irrigation methods he had never seen before, channeling water from the creek in clever ways that kept their crops alive even in the driest weather. The Apache children were fascinated by his light hair and pale skin, following him around and giggling when he tried to speak their language. The adults were more reserved, but they treated him with polite respect. He was a guest in their home, and they took that responsibility seriously. Nalnish became his guide and teacher, explaining Apache customs and helping him avoid accidentally giving offense. Thomas learned that the Apache were not the savage warriors depicted in newspaper stories back east. They were families just like his own, trying to survive and protect their way of life. Why do people fear you so much? Thomas asked one evening as they worked together mending horse gear. Because we fight to protect what is ours. Nalnish replied simply, your people take our land, kill our animals, pollute our water. What would you do if strangers came to your farm and did such things? Thomas had no answer for that. Put that way, the Apache resistance made perfect sense. They weren't mindless killers. They were defending their homes and families just as he would do if faced with the same situation. As the days passed, Thomas began to see a future he had never imagined. Maybe staying with the Apache wouldn't be temporary. Maybe they could build a real life here, bridging two very different worlds.